Thank you. Actually, it's an argument from possibility, not from contingency. And as he mentioned, it's not one of Al's, which I guess indicates that there are still new things happening in the field. It's not totally a bad thing. Okay, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to sketch the argument as a whole. Then I'm going to read what I think is the crucial section, just reading it as a paper. Okay, so first, the argument from possibility as a whole. Here are the things I argue. We need to be realists about possibility, particularly about unrealized possibility. That's to say, we should accept that there are mind-independent truths about unrealized possibility. And in this argument, unless I say otherwise, unqualified modal terms like possibility always refer to broadly logical or metaphysical or absolute possibility, that sort. That includes being realists about unrealized maximum-sized possibilities, the sort of things that get called possible worlds. Now, suppose we are realists about possibility. Then we need an ontology. We want to know, in what do possibility facts consist? What sort of entities in the world go into making true possibility claims true? So how do we pick an ontology? Well, we look for a theory with the best overall set of the relevant theoretical virtues. Now, what are the theoretical virtues for theories in ontology? There are a number of them, but the three that are particularly important here are as follows. First, we want our theory to acknowledge all the truths in the domain in question. We want to have a theory that acknowledges, in this case, all the truths about possibility that there are. Second, we want a theory that does provide truth makers for all those truths. Take truth makers as you will. I'm not making some big commitment by talking about that. Finally, we want a theory that's as parsimonious as it can be. We want to posit nothing without necessity. So those are the three virtues that we especially are looking to maximize in making our choice of theory. Now, what then is the overall strategy of the argument? Well, the most parsimonious sort of theory you could get, if you're realist about unrealized possibility, including possible worlds, would be one that is first naturalist, that acknowledged only things in the natural world. Second, that is actualist, that did not deal in possibilia. Third, that is nominalist, that doesn't deal in abstract entities. If you can get a theory like that, great. You've scored really high on parsimony, and if you're okay on the other two, you're probably home free. So I'm going to look at naturalist theories of possibility, and I'm going to see what can be said for and against them. I'm going to claim that the best one, and I'll say why it's the best, gets the extension of possibility wrong. It has to give up too many intuitively possible things for it to work. So suppose that's right. Suppose that the best naturalist theory of possibility might score very well for parsimony, but it gives up too many possibilities to be an acceptable theory. Well, what then? We want a theory that's going to add as little as possible to our ontology and yet get the extension of possibility right. I argue that the minimum addition we can make to get an extensionally adequate theory, one that covers all the intuitive possibilities, adds one thing, a being that looks remarkably like God, because it has, for example, the properties of omnipotence, necessary existence, eternality, and so on. So what I'm going to do now is read what I think is the key section of the argument, which is where I take on first the task of determining what the best naturalist theory is, and then the task of arguing that that theory leaves out too much of what we intuitively think is possible to be an acceptable theory. Time permitting, I'll then talk about why you make the further addition that I recommend. Okay. The most parsimonious theory would be actualist, avoiding the abstract, actualist, avoiding the merely possible, and nominalist, avoiding the abstract. And in judging theories, we're going to be respecting the constraint that these theories must be realist about unrealized possibility. That lets conventionalist accounts out. They are actualist, they are nominalist, but they are not realist about the extent of the possible. This constraint also rules out conceptualist accounts. Conceptualist accounts also, in effect, are not realist about the possible. They're as if they were conventionalist accounts where the conventions are set somehow by human conceiving powers, either actual or in the ideal case. So, the actualist, nominalist theories of possibility worth taking seriously will hold that there are objectively unrealized absolute possibilities and find the ontology for these outside our control, our convention, and our natures. The only such theories on the market, and perhaps the only such theories possible, find this ontology in the powers of actual things. They say states of affairs are possible just if there are powers of certain sorts. Now, a theory can say this with a clean conscience, being nominalist at the same time, only if it can give you a nominalist construal of powers. And that's, of course, an interesting project. I'm inclined to say that a nominalist can make a go of saying something like this: there really are no such things as powers. Power talk, in the end, is talk about concrete particulars and things that happen in their vicinity and that sort of thing. At any rate, for the purposes of this talk, spot me that. Okay, so the basic thought behind my powers approach to modality is this. Consider actual history, populated by powerful, concrete things with chances to act. These things, with these opportunities, are able to drive history along many paths. Anything that happens along any one of these paths that these powers with these opportunities might drive history down is possible. It's possible because those things have those chances to bring them about. That basic thought admits of many variations. The notion of what I call causal possibility is complex. Powers theories say that what makes an unrealized possibility claim P true is the existence of appropriate powers, powers to bring it about that P, or bring about that there are powers to bring it about P, etc. And those powers having appropriate chances, chances to bring it about that P, or chances to bring it about that there are chances to bring it about P, and so on. The notion gets very complex because you can have chances to have chances and chances. It just goes on. Okay. Some powers theories are naturalist. That's to say they limit themselves to powers of ordinary physical concreta. A naturalist powers theory is my candidate for the most parsimonious naturalist theory because it doesn't deal in anything but natural, actual, concrete things. But I now argue such theories face a problem of extension. Consider, for example, the possibility of alternate natural laws. If ours is the only universe, and there are only ordinary physical, natural, concrete things, there never has been anything able to bring it about that E equals mc to the third, or bring about anything able to bring it about that E equals mc to the third, etc. Yet, it does seem possible that E equal mc to the third. If ours is one universe within a multiverse, perhaps elsewhere in the multiverse, E equals mc3, E equals mc4, and so on, for all possible variations of all possible laws. But to posit all universes needed to actualize all possible laws would give up, rather than provide ontology for, the claim that there are unrealized, absolutely possible laws, because those laws would be realized elsewhere in the multiverse. It would also give up the claim that those laws are possible because there are powers able to bring them about. Rather, those laws would be possible simply because they are actual elsewhere in the multiverse. Further, there are endless events that could occur only under different laws. For example, my now leaping 10 feet off the surface of the Earth unaided. The modal evidence that these things could occur, of which more anon, is about as good as that for the possibility of the laws themselves. And there is no principled reason to care only for ontology for laws, not about ontology for particular events. So we also need ontology for those particular possible events. And if we posit universes for laws, and we want to keep to ordinary physical concrete things in our ontology, we must also posit universes which contain these other possible physical events. Now, to add more universes would give up, rather than provide ontology for, the claim that there are these unrealized absolute possibilities. They wouldn't be unrealized, they'd simply be realized in another universe. It would further restrict the cases in which a powers approach actually does any work. These things wouldn't be possible because there are powers to bring them about. They'd be possible because they're actual elsewhere in the multiverse. It would also require, for example, that I exist in these other universes, since it is possible, so far as we can judge, that I exist in a universe in which the laws are so altered that I make the 10-foot jump. But of course, I can't exist in more than one universe. My life cannot consist of causally disconnected segments, and any causal connection between segments of my life in supposedly different universes would connect the universes causally, thus contradicting the claim that they are different universes. What we can have are Leftow counterparts in other universes to represent possibilities for me. Given these, we're well on our way to David Lewis's metaphysics, although we require fewer universes and counterparts if we let counterparts' powers ground some possible actions, events, and so on. The powers theorist who adds universes must either adopt counterpart theory or else give up at least as many apparent possibilities, for example, my making the 10-foot jump, as he or she would have given up had he or she not posited universes with other laws. And so, without counterpart theory, adding universes for laws does not provide all the ontology possibility needs, and is left, therefore, unmotivated. By the way, if you do think that I could have a life consisting of causally disconnected segments, I could actually give you that and still get the same result in the end, so don't worry about that bit. Okay. If the power theorist adds a universe for every apparent possibility for all particulars, the result is David Lewis's ontology. At this point, there's no longer any modal work left for powers to do, nor are there unrealized possibilities for them to do it for. Every possible state of affairs obtains somewhere in the Lewis multiverse. So we're out of a powers approach altogether. I would argue that the move to Lewis forfeits also the ontological economy, which is nominalism's main appeal. Suppose, then, that the naturalist powers theorist adds only some counterparts, enough in various universes for their powers to ground all alternate possibilities, but not a counterpart and a universe for everything possible to every possible particular. That does leave work for powers to do, grounding the possibility of universes in which these particulars have other careers. But here, a question of arbitrariness would arise. Why posit just a universe in which my counterpart turns left at t, but has then the power to turn right, or just one in which he turns right at t, but has then the power to turn left? What basis could there be to believe in one universe rather than the other as a basis for both possibilities? Now, the naturalist powers theorist couldn't just say, well, I say that there are enough counterparts and enough universes to make all the things true, but I make no claims about what particular lives these counterparts lead. I'm going to be agnostic about that. How would I know? There would have to be a fact of the matter about this, even if the powers theorist ducks the question of what the fact of the matter is. And it would be apparently purely arbitrary what that fact is. There would be no reason to have a universe in which the counterpart turns left but has the power to go right, rather than the universe in which the counterpart turns right but has the power to go left. We ought not to posit sheer arbitrariness where we can help it. Thus, naturalist powers theorists should not add universes to try to ground the full intuitive range of the possible. All it does is get you Lewis in the end or else arbitrariness in the end, and neither is really a good way to go. Instead, naturalists should remain within one universe and restrict the range of the possible. Let's henceforth call their theory restrictive naturalism, or RN. Restrictive naturalism is restrictive because it says that much of what we intuitively think possible is not really possible, because there is just the one universe containing just the natural objects with their natural powers, and so anything that actual natural objects can't bring about by their natural powers doesn't count as metaphysically possible. Thus, it is not metaphysically possible that I make the 10-foot leap here on Earth unaided, and it is not metaphysically possible that E equals mc3 if there are no actual natural powers to bring these things about. So restrictive naturalism restricts the range of the possible. That's how it makes sure that it's got enough truth makers. It says we've only got as many truths about possibility as we do actual natural powers. And it's also the most parsimonious naturalist theory because it restricts itself to natural objects in just this one universe. So it's the best competitor for naturalism, I think, but it comes at a cost, the cost of restricting the range of the possible well below what we intuitively think it is. I now argue against restrictive naturalism. What we take to be standard sources of modal evidence strongly support the possibility, for example, of alternate laws. The proposition that E equals mc to the third is logically consistent and mathematically unimpeachable. It's conceivable. That is, considered in the abstract, it has sort of a sheen of apparent possibility about it. Physicists can reason counterfactually about how things would be if E equals mc3 without running into anything contra-logical or contra-mathematical. They might well be able to imagine or model in detail how such a world would run. Further, we can all vividly imagine events that require other laws. I can vividly imagine making the 10-foot leap, and we can all spin tales about wizards. This is evidence for the possibility of the event types themselves, not just the laws that would make these event types physically possible. Now, all this evidence for unrealized possibility is defeasible, but all the same, logical and mathematical consistency, imaginability, intuition of possibility, ability to model in detail, and ability to fill out counterfactual suppositions consistently and in detail are our only armchair support for claims of unrealized possibility. So what I've done is inventory the kinds of modal evidence we usually appeal to for possibility claims and say that relative to these sources of evidence, the possibilities that restrictive naturalism wants to get rid of look pretty strongly supported. So, if such evidence supports false possibility claims as regularly as restrictive naturalism must say that it does, that sort of evidence does not reliably indicate truth. Much of the time it gets it wrong. Given that sort of evidence, the chance of false belief is quite significant. Belief based on it is not safe in the technical sense. So on a wide variety of accounts of knowledge, on restrictive naturalism, we rarely know that any non-actual state of affairs is possible. And even the claim that we reasonably believe claims about non-actualized possibility is true only in a deflated way. It's this: our belief is reasonable only in the sense that we go on bad evidence, and perhaps bad evidence is better than none. If restrictive naturalism is right, even claims about possibilities based on natural powers would rarely be known, since even when these claims have empirical evidence behind them, we think out what the evidence indicates with counterfactual suppositions, and it's counterfactual thinking, the reliability of which Rn calls into question. This degree of modal skepticism is probably unwarranted. We regularly confirm possibility claims reached from the armchair. Things we judge possible on such bases turn out actual later. Such confirmation suggests that armchair modal methods are, in fact, fairly reliable. Further, the goal in modal ontology, as elsewhere in philosophy, is reflective equilibrium. We start with a set of data which includes all that seems to us possible and necessary. As a starting point, we have not yet applied criteria for rejecting only some data if we have such criteria, and so at a starting point we must treat all data as innocent until proven guilty. It is inevitable that theory building wind up rejecting some of our initial data, since it is inevitable that not all that seems true to us actually turns out to be true. But precisely because all data start as innocent, we ought to resist giving up any of them, at least initially. That means the more our initial data, our beliefs about what is possible, that Rn requires us to give up, the more our resistance should be to accepting what Rn wants us to do. And the higher the bar Rn faces for actually justifying the claim that we should give up all these data. Given the extent of what Rn asks us to forego, we ought to be quite skeptical that Rn can really make its case. Finally, my third argument against Rn. Suppose that some deterministic interpretation of quantum theory turns out correct, Bohm's or the Everett story or something. Then given Rn, only what is actual is metaphysically possible. Given Rn, if determinism is true, everything actual is absolutely necessary. Given Rn and determinism, almost every possibility claim supported by only the usual evidence for possibility claims is false. Complete skepticism about our modal evidence would follow from that. I mean, everything we merely conceive to be possible, if it's not what physical causes determined to happen, on this scenario isn't so much as metaphysically possible at all. So we need to be almost completely skeptical about our modal evidence then, because it almost never gets it right. Rn has no grounds not to take the Bohm or Everett interpretations, at least fairly seriously. So Rn has to admit that on Rn, these unpalatable modal consequences and this extreme modal skepticism are fairly live options. But surely they should be at best not very live options. So my three arguments against Rn are, number one, it generates a probably false degree of modal skepticism. Second, it faces a very high presumption, that a very high bar for making its case because of the amount of our data, our initial beliefs about possibility that it asks to give up. And third, it should take more seriously than we want to take the possibility of the sort of modal skepticism we would have if determinism were true. Okay, so that's my main argument. Let me now consider three responses to the main argument, that is, to what I've said basically exclusive of the final determinist bit. A naturalist might say, there is no real loss in Rn because we ought, in any case, to limit ourselves to modal judgments somehow backed by science. If things have powers, science will gradually converge on correct views of what powers things have and what these powers are able to affect. So science will, if followed obediently, gradually bring our modal beliefs into conformity with the only grounds for possibility there are, the natural powers of natural things. Meanwhile, whereof science does not speak, thereof one should be silent. Okay. Now, one question this reply raises is what backs the should in thereof we should be silent. It certainly doesn't follow deductively from science will tell us in time. Another question this reply raises is why we shouldn't think that science will eventually tell us that we have the power to arrive reliably at true modal beliefs from the armchair by non-scientific means. In fact, our regular confirmation of inexperience of modal beliefs reached from the armchair is some reason to expect that science will tell us that we do have this ability. Again, the claim that only science can be a reliable guide to modality is not a scientific proposition, but it is a modal proposition. I emphasized the can. So it seems to undercut itself. So it's not something one can consistently maintain. Suppose that a naturalist weakens the claim to only science is likely to be a reliable guide to modality. Well, that claim, too, is actually modal. It comes out as likely true only as a claim about near possible worlds. If you read the likely along frequentist or subjectivist lines, it's false, or likely false. For as noted, we have fairly good confirmation, a posteriori, for modal beliefs from the armchair. And that confirmation is enough to undercut the claim that only science is likely to be a good guide to modal truth. For example, if you read the likely there in frequentist terms, the claim would be only science gets it right a lot of the time, but frankly we get it right a lot of the time from the armchair, and we know that by the experiential confirmation we get later that what we thought possible is in fact actual. Okay. Suppose the naturalist weakens the claim still further to simply science is the best guide to modal truth, or science is likely to be the best guide to modal truth. That does not seem strong enough to back the naturalist reply that we should limit ourselves to what science tells us about modality. because it is not generally the case that we ought to assert only what is backed by the best method in a given area. Other methods may have roles to play too. Whereof science does not speak, thereof others may speak reliably. Further, science itself requires armchair modal methods. Scientists designing experiments have to form beliefs like, if I use this apparatus in this way, I can get a measurement that I cannot otherwise obtain. Now, when they make that judgment, the scientist is not just making a judgment about the abilities of the apparatus. The scientist is making a judgment about the way physical reality of only partly known nature might interact with that apparatus. Scientists whose armchair thinking does not fairly reliably indicate genuine possibility, thus will not design many successful experiments. And so the success of science is itself some evidence for the reliability of modal judgments warranted not wholly by current science, but at least partly by armchair, partly empirical thinking about unrealized possibility. Whereof science does not speak alone, thereof even science had better listen. Okay, so that's one response to my main argument and what I have to say back to that response. A second response to the main argument would be this. I have strong reason to think that the true ontology of modality is just that of restrictive naturalism. So I ought to limit myself to modal claims the true ontology can ground. So I ought to dismiss appearances of possibility that go beyond what restrictive naturalism would allow. When I know what the laws are, I know something about the limits of actual physical powers. So I should dismiss any contra-legal possibility claim. So again, no loss when Rn says much of what we say is possible intuitively isn't in fact possible. Now, this second reply is incomplete, and so it's not fully evaluable. We have to know what the claimed strong reasons to believe that the true ontology of modality is just Rn's ontology are. But one point worth making is that we likely do not know all the laws, and our current beliefs that such and such are the laws are fallible beliefs. Had Newton had the attitude this second response recommends, and then been presented with an exposition of general relativity, and had Newton not borne ignorance and fallibility in mind, Newton would have dismissed general relativity as impossible. But if we do bear ignorance and fallibility in mind, how can we rationally dismiss possibility claims that break our current understanding of the laws just for being contra-legal? For all we know, these may represent the real laws. Real laws have ceteris paribus clauses. For all we know, the reason I never do make the 10-foot jump, try as I may, is that earthside conditions are a local case where the cetera are not paras, are not equal, and the real laws operating elsewhere would permit me the 10-foot jump. Okay, so that's second response and my countermove to that. Finally, someone might argue that the skeptical worry for Rn is no worse than for most other modal metaphysics. Anyone who holds that there is more to absolute necessity than analyticity facially obvious a priori must grant that there may be hidden necessities, that despite our best a priori thinking, things which seem impossible a priori might turn out impossible due to necessities not available a priori, or available a priori but only to minds a good deal sharper than ours. Now, I agree that modal ontologies must allow for there being necessities hidden a priori, but this becomes a problem only when the scope and nature of these threatens to create a skepticism about the results of a priori modal metaphysics, modal methods. That's true of Rn, but not of competing views. So Rn has a much deeper problem with hidden necessity than other views, because Rn, by denying a whole bunch of possibility, says there is a whole bunch of necessity that we wouldn't suspect. Okay, so Rn is, as I've claimed, the best naturalist competitor for a theory of possibility. But it has a problem. It requires us to give up the claim that much of what we intuitively think is possible really is possible. I've tried to put pressure on that claim by pointing out the epistemological consequences, the fact that it gives us a sort of a fairly deep modal skepticism without much effort. I've considered 3 responses to my argument that the consequences of Rn are unacceptable, and I've tried to deal with those responses. If you think I've sort of made my case, then if that's the best naturalist competitor, we shouldn't be naturalists about possibility. So what then do we want to add to the ontology? Okay, we're doing powers ontology, so what we want to add are enough powers to be able to bring about everything that is intuitively, broadly, logically possible. Well, that is, at a first pass, the traditional range of power associated with omnipotence. So what we want to get into the picture somehow are enough powers to constitute omnipotence one way or the other, because when you've got omnipotence on the screen, you've got power enough to bring anything absolutely possible about. And so on a powers basis, all that absolute possibility does come out possible. So we want a totality of powers adding up to omnipotence. Now you could cite those powers in many beings, but obviously it's simpler, more parsimonious to say there is just one thing. And so the most parsimonious addition, I would suggest, is a single omnipotent being, one that gives us all the extra powers we need. Okay, now, since there are, okay, I'm one over, okay, then I'll stop. You're fine. Oh, okay. Okay. Since there are eternally these possibilities, we want there to be eternally the omnipotent being. Now, you could eternally just have a series of many, but again, it'd be simpler to have one, more parsimonious, and you wouldn't face questions about why, when one omnipotent being leaves the scene, there's always another there to take its place. There are necessarily these possibilities, so we necessarily want an omnipotent being, and similar reasoning is going to get you to the necessity of what we want. So what we've got quickly is that the most parsimonious addition would be a necessarily existent eternal omnipotent being. With these properties, it's also got to be non-physical. I could, if I had the time, give you an argument that it's going to come out as a rational agent, but for that you'll have to read the book.
All right. Thank you. It worked out perfect for us to get a cliffhanger. He's just here trying to hawk his wares, man. He's just trying to sell his book. He's got a stand in the back where you can buy them. Tyrone. Hold on. I'm coming. I like your pants.
They're salmon.
Leslie Salmon.
Nathan Salmon. On your last point about necessity, I have a few questions, I guess, but this was the first one.
Pick one.
I'd like a theory of possibility to treat possibility in a similar sort of way that it treats necessity. So if you're going to ground possibility in causal powers, I'd like a theory to ground necessity in something like that too. And I'm just trying to think through it now, but I'm wondering how you do that. Can I ask another one? No, just one. Okay. So that's that was just maybe that's the book, but if you could give a hint about that, I'd be appreciative.
60 pounds from Oxford University Press. Well, okay. One way you can sort of get necessity out of powers is by saying where the powers run out. Okay, suppose you've just got powers to bring it about that something is red and and powers to bring it about that something is green, and that's it. Those are all the powers. Well, then necessarily nothing is blue. Why? Because there is no possibility for something being blue. Because there is no power to bring it about, there's something new. Similarly, why is it necessary that 2 and 2 make 4? Well, there is no power for anything to bring it about that 2 and 2 make anything else. So you can get the necessities out of lacks of power. Out of lacks of power, you get impossibility. If powers are the truth makers for possibility claims, then the lack of power is the basis for impossibility claims. And impossibility gives you necessity in the obvious way.
Alex Bruce, Baylor University.
If you don't like that, we can follow up afterwards. The necessity of God is a complicated case, so we can talk about it afterwards, but I don't want to get into it right now. Pounds.
Okay, this is another question from Tyrone. We were talking last night, and he raised the worry as to why on earth we would think that parsimony is a guide to truth in metaphysics. So you can kind of see why it would be a guide to truth in science. At least if you're a theist, you might see why it would be a guide to truth in science, because God loves whatever is beautiful, and the simple is beautiful insofar as it's simple. But why think that parsimony is a guide to truth in metaphysics?
Okay. Last night I realized that I was probably going to get that question, and I really regretted not bringing the book with me because it's in there. Okay. I do deal with that in God and Necessity. I'll just say two things. One is this. Regardless of whether parsimony is a guide to truth in metaphysics, it is in fact a rule followed in the ontology game. I mean, we all think that getting a parsimonious theory is good for one thing. It is good for some reason. If that's right, consistency demands following the rule even here, where it might lead one toward theism. So whatever the role of parsimony, we don't have if we use it elsewhere, we don't have the right to drop it just when we don't like where it might bring us. But the second thing, and this is only sort of a rough stab at trying to remember something that I said in print. Suppose you've got a set of phenomena that are adequately explained by positing X, Y, and Z. If that's true, it seems something like the following. It is going to come out true, that positing W in addition would be in effect a posit without evidence. There's no evidence for W if you've adequately explained everything without W. If that's right, then flouting parsimony is relevantly like positing things without evidence. It's like making just guesses about what's there. We know that that's not truth conducive. And so parsimony comes out as truth conducive, at least in the weak sense that following it avoids this non-truth conducive habit of positing things without adequate evidence.
Next question is from Liz Jackson, University of Notre Dame.
I had a question. So some of your worries about RN said that they restrict possibility too much, and so things turn out to be impossible that should be possible. But I wonder if the defender of RN could sort of turn it on the theist in the following way. So suppose God is a necessary being, and suppose he's necessary omnibenevolent. Then it seems like there's a certain threshold of goodness that worlds must meet in order to be possible, and worlds that are really bad would be impossible because of God's omnibenevolence. But if it does, in fact, seem possible that the world was really, really bad, then it seems like the theist's notion of possibility is also restricted in a way that might be problematic. So I wonder what you think about that.
That's an excellent comeback, and it's a real problem for me. I think the best I can do with it right now is to say something like this. The theist is going to be giving up some apparent possibilities, but the theist has something like skeptical theism to... Okay, sorry, that's going in the wrong direction. Two things. One, the theist may have to give up fewer possibilities than we may think the theist has to give up, given the possibility of skeptical theism being invoked. In other words, you describe a state of affairs, and you say, well, this is surely too bad for God to allow us, this might not be possible. Well, a skeptical theist might say, well, there could be an unknown good which might make this, after all, something God could allow. And so there might be less to be given up on the theist side than you might think. If that's true, then I think the odds are the theist is going to wind up restricting significantly less than RN is going to do.
Okay, Scott Sullivan, University of St. Thomas.
Yeah, I just had a question, and you may have hit on this at the end, I'm not sure, but I'm wondering if we could expound on the nature of possibility a little bit and say that they're also eternal and necessary. Did you say that at the end?
Yeah.
Okay. And then so if that's the case, then whatever's metaphysically possible has always been so and can't be otherwise, can't be impossible. And then so whatever would explain that possibility would also have to account for its necessity and its eternality, correct?
Right.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if, all right, I just want to make sure you said that. And are those two properties of possibility, that the necessity and the eternality, does that maybe make it more difficult for RN to explain that?
I lost you at the end there. I'm not quite sure what the question is.
Yeah, does that add, I guess, since I've added those two properties in just through clarification, does that make it more difficult for RN to explain possibility because they're having, it's not just merely possibility, but it's eternal and necessary possibility?
Okay. Yeah. Well, it depends on how RN sort of cashes things out. Suppose the restrictive naturalist is a fan of a tenseless theory of time. Then, on a tenseless theory, all of time is just there. None of it passes away, none of it comes to be, it just is. So for a tenseless theorist of time, you've got eternally, so to speak, all the truth makers that possibility claims are ever going to have because they're all just given. On the other hand, if the naturalist holds to a tense theory of time, then things do get more difficult because it seems like you haven't always got all the truth makers, and you want to know what happens to possibilities whose powers go away. I think maybe there might be a way to handle that, but it might be a little complicated. As far as the necessity of possibilities, I would need to think about how that would go with RN. It could be that they have a difficulty there. I just haven't thought about it.
Next question is from Todd Burris, Baylor University, and unfortunately we're going to have to only just have one more question, which I'll give to Robin Collins next.
So my question is in the family of Liz's, though I think hers was probably better. The dialectic turned at the end, your dialectic against the naturalist account there, turned at the end when you acknowledged fairly quickly the reality of hidden necessities, even for the naturalist. And I didn't hear you say, or perhaps you did, anything that would constrain the skeptical consequences of acknowledging, as I think everybody needs to, that there are hidden necessities. So could you address that?
Okay. When you acknowledge that there are hidden necessities, you're acknowledging that you could be wrong about some possibility claims. That's something we should all accept anyway. We know that we're fallible. So far, there's no particular skeptical worry. A skeptical worry arises when you've got something in your metaphysics that suggests that there is a very great deal of hidden necessity. That's not particularly there for the theist, but I've argued that it is there for the naturalist.
Okay, Robin Collins.
I'm wondering why, it wasn't quite clear to me why somebody, for a lot of these possibility claims that are eliminated under RN, why they couldn't just say, well, those are really conceptual possibilities, with conceptual possibilities spelled out in terms of the actuality of someone has consistently conceived of this. And for example, in the scientific experiment case, within the model, you can, if this actually happens in the world, if I actually do this experiment in the world, then the model predicts X, Y, and Z is going to occur. And if I don't do it, then there's nothing you can say because it would be then a counterfactual.
Okay, that's exactly what they will say. They'll say that the sort of possibility involved is conceptual, or it's doxastic, or it's epistemic. It's anything but metaphysical. And they'll try to sort of save the phenomena to some extent by doing that. My response is simply that that's not how the intuition goes with us. We don't make that qualification. We just say this seems like a metaphysical possibility. That's how it presents itself to us. And so if all the naturalist can do is say, well, the intuition really counts for something less than that, that again is giving something significant up.
Okay, thank you, Brian Leftow.